media, technology, history, and America's godly heritage. We talk about anything that affects your faith, your family, or your freedom. So don't go anywhere, because Point of View starts right now.
Across America, live, this is Point of View. And now, Kerby Anderson.
Thank you for joining me today here on Point of View. In the first hour, we're going to again focus some of our time and attention on the news, what's happening, and then we will, in the second hour, be talking with an individual that grew up as a skeptic and really became a Christian and even a pastor and has a church to really minister to and to challenge skeptics. So we'll be talking about his book in the second hour. But we will talk a little bit about President Donald Trump's presentation last night about the Afghanistan war. We'll talk about that in just a minute. We have some information, obviously, about what is going to transpire as he and the vice president head to Phoenix. And it's interesting that after going to Phoenix and speaking at the Phoenix Convention Center, he will also go to Yuma, Arizona. And actually, I guess he's going there right now. And the original idea was for him to go to the border, because after all, he'll actually, when he talks with the border control officials, only be about 15 miles from the border. But of course, they don't want him to do that because of security reasons. And it occurred to me this would have been a great opportunity for the President of the United States to invite the President of Mexico to meet him at the border. You know that the President of Mexico would not do that because he is well aware of the violence at the border, and the fact that he would be telling him, no, we can't do that because of security reasons, would make the case even more so why we need a wall. It's so dangerous to consider either president to go to the border between the United States and Mexico. But we'll get into that in just a minute. But I did want to mention just in passing, and of course this is certainly a topic we can address again as we have before. The attempt to continue to erase our history moves ahead unabated. We talked about the fact that just the other day at the University of Texas in Austin, workers removed various statues. I got one picture here, was taken, I think, by a cell phone, of them removing the Confederate General Robert E. Lee statue from the South Mall. This was done sort of in the dead of night, so they wouldn't have to talk about it. They wouldn't have to ask permission for it or anything else. But what this has done is created all sorts of other individuals who've decided, well, if that's what you're going to be doing on the university campuses, let's do it in all of our city parks as well. And so we have an individual that was arrested for trying to blow up the General Dowling Monument in Houston's Herman Park. This individual was in possession of a timer, wires, duct tape, two types of explosive, including nitroglycerin. Where did he get that? And this was an individual that just simply said, well, if you're going to be tearing down all these statues, let me just help you out, and I'll blow up the one there in Houston. Of course, he's been charged and actually could spend time in a federal prison and with a fine of $250,000. We'll see how that plays out. But it illustrates the point. Every day we hear of other statues coming down, other people calling for statues to come down. And the question that I want to ask a little bit later is a column by Dr. Bernard Goldberg. Where does it end? And so we'll talk about that a little bit later. But this latest charging of an individual in Houston trying to destroy a particular statue that is related to the Confederacy. And after all, his argument probably in court will be, you were going to take some of them down anyway. I was just going to hasten the actions and make sure that it was no longer going to be standing in that city park. So that just illustrates again the insanity that is unfolding before us at our very eyes, even without a discussion, certain statues being taken down, other individuals pulling them down, or in this case, somebody wanting to blow one up. And I'm sure we will be reporting more of those every single day. Let's get back to the speech last night by President Donald Trump. He didn't give us a lot of specifics, but nevertheless promised a stepped-up military campaign against the Taliban, who, as he says, has gained ground against the Afghan government. He also spent a fair amount of time singling out Pakistan for harboring militants in safe harbors on its soil. And so this is an accusation that the leaders of Pakistan denied, but I think it's pretty much undeniable in light of what we've seen here before. If you have any memory at all of what happened after 9/11 and Osama bin Laden, you remember where we found him, in Pakistan. And there are many others there as well. Even though President Donald Trump did not give specifics, we do know that the Defense Secretary, James Mad Dog Mattis, has plans to send another approximately 4,000 more troops to Afghanistan. And what I think is so intriguing about all of this is that Donald Trump was very honest as a candidate, and President Trump was very honest last night about saying that his initial instincts were to actually withdraw and to pull American troops out. If you remember the campaign this time last year, candidate Donald Trump sounded a lot more like candidate Ron Paul than he sounded like candidate Lindsey Graham. And here now he, of course, last night spoke, and one of his very initial defenders was Lindsey Graham, of all people. So he pointed out in the speech that although it was, as he said, my initial and original instinct to pull out all American troops, he says he was convinced by his military advisors after a lengthy review that this is not what we should do. And, of course, then we have to say that these extra troops will join the approximately 8,400 U.S. troops in Afghanistan that work with NATO. What has been the response from NATO? Well, this particular article comes down, and it says that the NATO allies today welcomed President Donald Trump's decision to commit more forces to Afghanistan as part of the new U.S. strategy. And they also said that they would require more troops and funding from America's partners. The General Secretary of NATO said that NATO remains fully committed to Afghanistan. And he went on to say that I am looking forward to discussing the way ahead with Defense Secretary James Mattis and our allies and international partners. If you add all the numbers up, there's about 12,000 troops in Afghanistan tied to NATO, and about 15 countries that have pledged more support. So we'll see how that plays itself out. But one of the questions I want to put on the table, and I'd love to hear from those of you that are in the military, have been in the military, perhaps even from some of you that have served with distinction in Afghanistan or Iraq, what your thoughts might be about this change of plans from President Donald Trump. It is America's longest war. There is no evidence that it will end anytime soon. And, of course, the hope is to eventually turn it over to the Afghan government forces. But so far, that hasn't worked very well. The arguments for it are we don't want to cut and run. We saw what happened in Iraq. That will provide a vacuum where al-Qaeda and especially ISIS or the Islamic State can come in. The downside is that we have spent an enormous amount of blood and treasure already in that region of the world. And if you think that people were war-weary when candidate Barack Obama became President Barack Obama, just add 8 years on to that calculus, and you can see perhaps the lack of enthusiasm on the part of many Americans for us to get involved even more so in Afghanistan. So I'd love to get your comments on that. Have some more things to put on the table, but if you'd like to join us as we react briefly to the statements and the speech by President Donald Trump about putting more troops in Afghanistan, we'd love to hear from you. 1-800-351-1212. Then we're going to move on to some other topics, but if you'd like to address that issue, we'll take your phone calls right after this.
This is Viewpoints with Kerby Anderson.
It was a grand experiment, declare a war on poverty and years later celebrate a victory. Unfortunately, poverty won the war. The percentage of people in poverty today is just slightly lower than the percentage in the 1960s when the war to end poverty began. Now, people living in poverty now are doing better than decades ago, but we certainly have not eliminated poverty. Peter Cove has a bold vision. The title of his book is Poor No More, Rethinking Dependency and the War on Poverty. He contends that the only thing that really helps end poverty is work itself. That was the foundation of the 1996 welfare reform bill, but hasn't been the focus for some time since. He understands the problem from the inside. He is founder of America Works, which is the first for-profit welfare-to-work company. He has created more than 1 million jobs for welfare recipients through various endeavors. He concluded that many of the government programs were not helping individuals because they stressed education and training over work itself. In the end, they had very little real-world work experience and were still dependent on government largesse. America Works instead offers employment services to state and local welfare agencies with the aim of placing welfare recipients in jobs quickly. Trainers work with clients on the basics, maintaining a business-like personal appearance, speaking properly, preparing a resume, and showing up on time. Clients quickly learn that success depends on their own self-discipline and on their own motivation and effort. Given the poor success rate of existing welfare programs, you would think that bureaucrats and politicians would be open to new ideas and concrete suggestions from people who have worked in the field. You would be wrong. Many liberal groups seem like they merely want to double down on the failed programs. That's why Peter Cove's book and ideas deserve a hearing. I'm Kerby Anderson, and that's my point of view.
From Sony Pictures, All Saints, the inspiring story of Pastor Michael Spurlock with John Corbett. In theaters August 25th, rated PG, allsaintsmovie.com.
You're listening to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Talking at the moment about the speech last night by President Donald Trump. If you'd like to join us, 1-800-351-1212. We'll talk about the rally he's holding in Phoenix, as well as his meeting with the U.S. Border Control officials in Yuma, Arizona, but his decision not to go to the border would have been a great photo op, and it would have been a great opportunity to challenge the president of Mexico to meet him there on the other side of the border, but I can see why they wouldn't want to have either of those two to go there, and that illustrates exactly why some people believe we need to begin to control our border. But if you'd like to join us, 1-800-351-1212. Let's go to Nevada first. Dale, thank you for joining us today here on Point of View.
Thank you. I've been pretty active in enjoying freedom and understand everything that's going on. I feel the American people need to consider that if we don't stabilize that region, we're not going to have safety at home.
Well, one of the reasons we headed there in the first place was Afghanistan was a very good training area for Osama bin Laden and al-Qaeda. Of course, since then, we've had the growth of the Islamic State, which is primarily more in Syria, in Iraq, and of course, we have real concerns about Iran having nuclear weapons. The whole region is unstable, but if we provide a place for the training of terrorists, the terrorist battle that we face right now is going to be more intense, don't you think?
Yes. That's a problem. Our biggest mistake was when we pulled out, as like President Trump was mentioning. By us pulling out of Iraq when we did, we caused a vacuum. And that just gave them full leeway of the region.
Well,
allowed them to get way too strong.
I appreciate your service and also appreciate your perspective today. So thank you for calling in.
Thank you. Appreciate it.
If you'd like to join us, 1-800-351-1212. Let's talk about a couple of things. As I said, of course, the president tonight will be speaking at the Phoenix Convention Center, but also is meeting with the border control officials in Yuma, Arizona. Closest border fence only about 15 miles away. And so it would be an opportunity for him to have had a good photo op, but that has been canceled. Now, it's really interesting to see how this is played out because, of course, the estimates are at the convention center, maybe 29,000 people will be there, but there's also a lot of plans for protest outside. You have, for example, the mayor of Phoenix who urged Donald Trump not to come to his city. You have all sorts of groups that have already indicated that they would attend this event. There's the Protest Trump Downtown Phoenix across the street. Then there are about 2,700 said they plan to attend the White Supremacy Will Not Be Pardoned, organized by another human group. Then you have one rally called Never Again, Jews and Allies Against Hate. And it's going to be hard, frankly, to keep track of all the different groups and what is actually taking place. And that kind of gets us back to one of the conversations we've had here before. You would hope that the rally would be peaceful. You would hope that the protest would be peaceful. But if you think that that's going to take place, then I do have some swampland I want to sell you because we are heading towards a time where almost always there is a level of street violence. Next week I have a commentary coming out on that, but we've already talked a little bit about this because of an article that came out by Jim Talent. Those of you from the state of Missouri remember him as a senator, and we've seen, as he's pointed out, that the violence that seemed to sometimes show up on a college campus, UC Berkeley is a good example, Middlebury College, and a few others, now that violence is making its way into the streets and even to our city parks and even into our neighborhoods. So he has some very concrete steps that we need to take in order to prevent this from taking place. And the first, he says, is that state laws must single out violence and disorderly conduct in the context of mass expression for special and certain punishment. What he's arguing is that it seems that we have kind of passed a line in which simply allowing somebody to get a plea deal is not going to be enough. And so he is convinced that one of the ways to address street violence is to actually have jail time, and that may be the only measure that will be sufficient to stop it. Now think about this. Once an individual is arrested, and especially if that individual is incarcerated, then his or her names, faces, and fingerprints are on the books. And what I think is happening sometimes here is somebody protests in California, then they protest in Virginia, then they protest in Washington, D.C., they protest in New York City, but these are all seen as isolated events. But once you actually are on the books, then that would mean that subsequent violations could be punished more harshly with even felony imprisonment when that might be warranted. So the first argument that is being used is that we have maybe crossed a line. And while we certainly recognize the ability of individuals to peacefully assemble and to protest and to express their First Amendment rights, sometimes these have been thugs that have used the street violence for a different kind of end, and to actually put them in jail, give them jail time and give them a prison record or at least some kind of arrest record would be really important. That comes to his second point, and that is he said that the laws must be strictly enforced. And he says this really is where some of the governors and mayors need to step up. He says too many mayors have been lenient for fear that they will suffer political consequences if they enforce the law against members of politically favored groups. And again, we understand the hesitancy. If you put somebody in jail who's part of Black Lives Matter, you know there's going to be fallout. If you put someone in jail that is part of Antifa, again, you know there may be some fallout. And this is where he says maybe that's why the governors need to step up in order to really provide protection. Sometimes these mayors can be overwhelmed very quickly. Just think of the number of groups that are going to protest in Phoenix tonight and how that could overwhelm the local law enforcement. And so that's why he says there is a real need to provide large numbers of well-trained and equipped personnel ready, whether from the state police or from the National Guards. And he also says that he thinks it's that governors should really make it their personal priority to ensure that state law enforcement personnel are properly trained and equipped. And of course, he recognizes, as a former politician, that there are political risks in taking some of these steps that he's outlined. But he also realizes that we, I think, tonight are going to see one more illustration of how street violence can get out of hand real quickly. And so officials oftentimes are hoping that if they just do nothing, the violence will come in and it will leave and they won't come back to their community. And they're just hoping they won't even have to deal with it in their jurisdictions. But if we're going to bring any kind of law enforcement back onto the streets and law and order back on the streets, these are some of the steps that are really going to have to be taken. Well, let's take a break, and when we come back, I want to take some more of your phone calls. Maybe you have some thoughts about how to deal with the street violence, even what might unfold tonight here in Phoenix, as President Donald Trump and the Vice President, as I understand, is going to join him as well, will be speaking at the Phoenix Convention Center, and that is going to be sort of almost a campaign type of rally. And so if you'd like to join us, 1-800-351-1212. We come back, I want to talk about a couple of the articles that I've posted here. One of those, no enemies on the left. That's a phrase that was used very often by those on the left. And as a result, John Fund has taken that in this particular article and pointed out that's the reason why there hasn't been too much of an attempt to really begin to deal with some of these particular groups. Yes, there have been certainly attempts to address the alt-right, but on the other side, you have Antifa, which stands for anti-fascist, and many of these groups are actually using violence or the threat of violence to shut down various rallies and to really begin to intimidate other individuals. So I want to talk about that for just a minute. And then one of the other articles that I've posted today before the hour is over that I want to talk about is, should Donald Trump's evangelical advisors abandon him? It's a piece by Michael Brown, which he points out that you've had one of the evangelical advisors step down, but in most cases they've stayed with him, unlike many of the business leaders that actually left Donald Trump after some of his so-called misstatements about Charlottesville. And so Michael Brown believes that, first of all, they should stay with him. If nothing else, these are individuals that should speak to the president and really wants to address that issue, but also wanted to begin to think about what are some of the comments being made about these advisors, some saying, well, they don't have as much moral compass as some of these business leaders. So I want to get into that issue as well, and we've posted those articles on our website, pointofview.net. As you go there, you can find those articles, you can read them and maybe forward them on to others, but I hope you'll also click on that button that says donate, because you can certainly help us financially as we are coming to the end of August and the end of a long and very difficult summer where our support has been down. We'll be back with more right after this.
There are those who listen to Point of View while they're driving, and some can listen at home or at work. But here's the question: where do you go where you cannot listen to Point of View? Well, if you have the app, the free Point of View radio app, the answer is just about nowhere. This is an on-the-go world, and now wherever you go, Point of View goes with you. Visit the Apple or Google Play Store and download the free Point of View app. You can listen and watch the program live or play it again later. Get Kerby's Viewpoints commentary. Click the Take Action link, learn about important issues, and make a difference in this world. You can also read articles, find a local radio station, easily contact us with your comments or questions. Don't leave home or the office or anywhere else without Point of View. Again, visit the Apple or Google Play Store today and get the app, the free Point of View radio app. Oh, and one more thing, if you like it, click that little button that says Donate Now and join the team. Point of View and the Point of View app, with you on the go.
Point of View will continue after this.
are listening to Point of View. The opinions expressed on Point of View do not necessarily reflect the views of the management or staff of this station. And now, here again is Kerby Anderson.
We'd like to join our conversation, 1-800-351-1212. One of the articles I posted today is by John Fund. He used to be with the Wall Street Journal, now writes with National Review. He's been on the program with us many times before, and points out that George Orwell pointed out and explained to us that really communists and fascists were a lot closer together than we might think. And if you don't remember that from the interview that I did with Dinesh D'Souza on his new book, The Big Lie, you might go to my August 17th commentary where we go into that in more detail. Well, John Fund goes on to say that this is one of the reasons why some on the left did not like George Orwell, because his argument was that a communist and a fascist were somewhat nearer to one another than either is to a Democrat. Because the idea that a lot of those on the left had, and even growing up in Berkeley, California, I heard this, and it was the phrase, no enemies on the left. And what it was used primarily was to say that, you know, on the left, you might have union workers, you might have African Americans, you might have environmentalists, you might have feminists. On a lot of issues, you disagree, but no enemies on the left. Conservatives never had that, but liberals certainly have over the years. And so the point he's making is this kind of philosophy has been the reason we haven't heard a lot of critical analysis of Antifa, which stands for anti-fascist. Now, we talked about that a couple of weeks ago with Dinesh D'Souza. I've got a commentary coming out on that as well. But he said that even if we look at Charlottesville, he said it doesn't mean that there were no victims of left-wing violence. Antifa, short for anti-fascist protesters, came armed with pepper spray, bricks, and clubs. Antifa members believe that racist speech is violence and that they must counter it physically, not just oppose it with rhetoric or better ideas. And so you have a situation in which, for example, some in the media themselves were attacked by Antifa. Taylor Lorenz of The Hill was punched in the face by an Antifa activist for recording something. A videographer from Richmond's WTVR covering the counter-protest got a concussion from head blows with a stick. And, of course, then we have one that I've mentioned before, and that is Cheryl Gay Stolberg. She's with the New York Times. I've read her before, and she oftentimes has been very critical of conservatives and maybe giving a little more of a pass sometimes to liberals. But it's interesting that she posted on one of her tweets, the hard left seems as hate-filled as alt-right. She said, I saw club-wielding Antifa beating white nationalists being led out of the park. Well, then a few minutes later, the backlash began very significantly. I'll just read one of the responders who said, don't buy into the false equivalency between Trump and sympathizers. Another one was talking about, a person died. How dare you say that? So very quickly, you all of a sudden had Cheryl Gay Stolberg saying, I got to rethink that tweet a little bit. And so, interestingly enough, going back to the piece by John Fund, he says, nor is Charlottesville the only place where Antifa activists have crossed the line. He says Peter Breinart has a piece in this month's Atlantic magazine noting that rioting by Antifa forces forced University of California at Berkeley officials to cancel speeches by Ann Coulter and Milo Yiannopoulos earlier this year. In April, threats by Antifa supporters convinced Portland, Oregon, and their police department that they couldn't guarantee security for the annual Rose Festival parade. Why? Because they said that if you allowed the local Republican Party to march under a Republican banner in the parade, they would threaten them. And so as a result, the parade was canceled. And this, I think, shows that it isn't always the actual violence. It's even the threat of violence that can shut down many of these ideas. And so then you might say, well, certainly people in government would have noticed this. Well, we have the U.S. Commission on Civil Rights. It held its monthly meeting in Washington, D.C., and one liberal member had a very stirring denunciation of the Nazis, the Ku Klux Klan, and the white nationalists, and that was a particular statement that they made. But then one of the other commissioners introduced an amendment that would have added the follow. Though we support peaceful protest and note that most of the counter demonstrators were peaceful, we condemn violence by anyone, including violence by so-called Antifa demonstrators. And there was no interest at all at the U.S. Commission on Civil Rights to actually add that amendment. Matter of fact, the argument from the chairwoman was that this would water down the main resolution because they did not want to condemn other violence. And so you can see how this has sort of played itself out. So you have the media reacting, I think, overreacting to Donald Trump saying there were bad actors on both sides. You have a lot of people in the media being told you can't cover this. And then you have even the U.S. Commission on Civil Rights being unwilling to condemn the violence of Antifa. And so it is, I think, helpful that John Fund at the end does at least talk about the fact that there are some clear-minded experts on extremist violence who don't have these ideological blinkers. And he quotes from the director of the Anti-Defamation League Center on Extremism, who said, "There is violence on the left. The anti-fascists engage with those they oppose through physical confrontation, and that is a problem. That is an extremist tactic. And there is also bigotry on the left." So 3 cheers for at least some people to speak truth to that particular issue. So if you'd like to join our conversation, 1-800-351-1212, talking about some of the street violence, educating you a little bit on Antifa. I'll get into more of that in just a minute. But let's take a phone call first, and we'll go to Georgia on the Good News Network. Ron, what would you like to add to our conversation today?
Hey, Kerby, thank you for taking my call today. I just wanted to add that it's really hard to deal with this situation because we really can't use total common sense and look at it in a total common sense way because everybody on the right is afraid of being painted with the brush of being a racist or a homophobe or a bigot. And while I am 100% totally against any kind of white supremacy or KKK, anything like that, I think that's ungodly and wrong. If the white supremacists have a rally and there are other people there to protest the rally and violence breaks out, it's always going to be the fault of the white supremacists. And their speech is protected, even though we don't like it, we disagree with it 100%. They're just as protected as anybody else is. But if there was, just say, a pro-abortion rally and some pro-life people were there and a skirmish broke out, it will always be the fault of the pro-lifers.
Yep, that's where the game is played, isn't it? Yeah, I mean,
we live in.
And Ken, we've seen this even as we grew up. We saw sometimes a kid hit one kid, and then the other kid defends himself and he's the one that gets suspended. So, I mean, we know that even when you have those in authority trying to be fair, sometimes they accuse the wrong person. But if you already come with your ideological blinders and believe that all the violence is due to the white supremacists, or I love your example because take it out of this race issue for just a minute, if there was ever a conflict between pro-life and pro-choice individuals, you know who would always get blamed as well, even if it was a pro-life rally and only a few pro-choice people showed up and started swinging at people. You can see how the ideological blinders determine who gets blamed and who gets a free pass. So I think your point's well taken.
And I really feel like, if I've got one more second, I really feel like President Trump's original statement that he caught so much flack over, I really think what he was trying to say was we have to stop all of this violence. You know, the counter protesters, we can't have violence there either. And man, we all see what happened about that.
Yeah, we certainly do. Well, and again, your point's well taken that certainly the people on the right don't want to speak out because they don't want to be seen as racist. But I wanted to add to that just before we take a break, and then we'll come back and take some more phone calls, and that is the people on the left don't either. The example I just gave you a minute ago, I mean, she has as impeccable progressive credentials as anybody out there, Cheryl Gay Stolberg, and yet as soon as she tweeted out that she saw some of the hard left as being hate-filled and wielding clubs, she had to almost immediately back off and retweet some of her conclusions. I suspect that this individual, Orrin Siegel, the director of the Anti-Defamation League Center on Extremism, probably has been receiving all sorts of flack for saying that there is violence on the left, there's bigotry on the left, and that's a problem too. So we'll see. But that's, I think, an illustration again that when you come to this, especially when you have a worldview bias, when you have ideological blinders, sometimes you just naturally blame one side, even when maybe they're not even at fault. Let's take a break. We'll take some more phone calls right after this.
Welcome to the First Liberty Briefing. I'm Jeremy Dice. In 1963, the Supreme Court of the United States ended the public reading of the Bible in public schools. For years, students in the school district of Abington Township listened to a student read a passage from the Bible, recite the Lord's Prayer, provide announcements, and end with everyone reciting the pledge of the American flag together. That was too much involvement by the school for the court. The court determined that neutrality had been breached and a violation of the Establishment Clause had occurred. But the question remains, can you teach the Bible in the public schools? The answer is yes. At the end of the court's opinion in Abington v. Shemp, the court noted, quote, "It might well be said that one's education is not complete without a study of comparative religion or the history of religion and its relationship to the advancement of civilization. It certainly may be said that the Bible is worthy of study for its literary and historic qualities. Nothing we have said here indicates that such study of the Bible or of religion, when presented objectively as part of a secular program of education, may not be affected consistently with the First Amendment." So the Bible can be taught in the schools. Exactly how is a more difficult conversation. To learn how First Liberty is protecting religious liberty for all Americans, visit firstliberty.org.
You can learn how to protect religious freedom in the workplace, public schools, your church, the military, and more by downloading First Liberty's free Religious Liberty Protection Kits at firstliberty.org. That's firstliberty.org. If you want hope for religious freedom, go to firstliberty.org.
Now, back to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
If you'd like to join our conversation, 1-800-351-1212. Let's head up to Michigan, listen on the American Family Radio. And Keith, thank you for joining us today here on Point of View.
Hi, thank you for taking my call.
Yes, what would you like to add?
Well, I'd like to add is that I recently was listening to NPR a couple of days ago. I tried to get both sides of the story of how things are happening. And they were reporting that the whole thing that was happening in Charlottesville is that all the violence was due to the right. That the people who were protesting and being violent and carrying clubs and being totally out of control was completely on the right. The left people, the people who are the Antifa, showed up to counter-protest to say, how dare you? And then all of a sudden the right started getting violent with clubs and other weapons. And it was all completely their fault. And the government, the police officers and the government there were completely caught off. They were completely surprised. It was like, wow, there's violence here. And they were completely off guard.
Well, and there are a couple issues. Number one is, we do have the evidence that some of the Antifa were carrying pepper sprays, bricks, clubs. So we already know that. I just gave you a few examples of even people in the media getting punched in the face and hit and all the rest. You have the record from the New York Times reporter. And of course we have some of the video. This is kind of in the category, Keith, of are you going to believe me or are you going to believe your lying eyes kind of a problem. But then the second point you made is something we kind of addressed yesterday, and I had not heard that until one of our callers reminded us and educated us about the fact that their permit had been withdrawn. So the Tiki Torch rally on Friday night was different than the group wanting to go to the park, and we were prevented from doing so because they didn't have a permit. Now, who threw the first punch or who got belligerent, maybe that is certainly those on the alt-right, the white supremacists, the neo-Nazis, the KKK. But it does look like Antifa came to fight. And in my commentary that's coming out next week, I take you through the history, going all the way back to the 1990s, where some of these individuals were involved in some of these street protests for the World Trade Organization, which is why I make the argument, quoting from Jim Talent, a former senator from Missouri, that if you gave these individuals jail time, then they would have a police record, because I suspect that they hop from one city to the next, and they maybe get post bail or they plead out or whatever it might be. And so there may be just a core of those individuals that use violence. But if you've ever watched some of these unfold, a little of that we could see in Charlottesville, but we didn't have the cameras on them like we did at University of California at Berkeley. You can recognize that this argument that it was all from the right isn't true. It just doesn't seem to stand up to any kind of scrutiny.
That's very true. One thing that I would also like to comment is that even though I do not believe in slavery and Confederacy and everything that the people who are maybe the Antifa were supporting, and everybody who is in the extreme right, I do support our American history.
Sure.
And it is important to have the statues, and it's not just the point of having, yes, this is supporting Confederacy. That's not the issue. The issue is that we need to remember our history. And there's that old saying from Santa Ana, if you do not learn from history, you're destined to repeat it. And we need those reminders, just as we do for communion for Christ.
Very good. Keith, I appreciate your call, and I'd love to chat with you again. Bernard Goldberg wrote a piece that came out, I guess it came out yesterday, and it's Where Does It End? And, there have been some people right now on Facebook and other things saying, let's get away from the slippery slope argument, because they're saying just because we tear down a statue of Robert E. Lee or Jefferson Davis or Stonewall Jackson doesn't mean we're going to tear down others. And there is some truth to that, but there also is the reality that people have wanted already to go beyond that. You have, as he points out here, a pastor in Chicago who wants the mayor to not only remove those kind, because I don't think there are any Robert E. Lee statues in Chicago, but there are statues of George Washington and Andrew Jackson. Well, that's reason enough to pull them down. Then he raises, how far do we go? Well, do we even change the name of Yale University because Elihu Yale actually was a merchant but also a slave trader? What about all these other things? George Washington, maybe we should just not even call our capital city Washington anymore. Maybe we shouldn't have the Washington Monument. You might say, well, nobody's going to suggest that. Oh, yes, Al Sharpton the other day actually said maybe we should either board up the Jefferson Memorial or change the name of it. Then he goes on to say, well, if you really want to talk about abuse, how about for the Japanese Americans, and tear down any monuments honoring Franklin Roosevelt, a man who put more than 100,000 Japanese individuals behind barbed wire during internment camps? I mean, it's a reasonable question. I recognize that you don't want to overplay the so-called slippery slope argument. That is a logical fallacy. But when you have so many people that are actually wanting to go even further than tearing down just some of the Confederate monuments, you can kind of see where this might lead. But let's go to Arizona. This is where there's going to be a lot of tension tonight in Phoenix. So Lillian, KNLB, you're right there. So tell us what you think might happen there in Phoenix.
Well, I just hope it's going to be peaceful. You know, first and foremost, we have to understand he's a president, and we have to give him respect and let him go ahead and do his job. When Obama was elected, did you see protests happen? No. When
maybe some.
Trump was elected, why are all these protests happening? This needs to stop. This is not acceptable, and they need to face reality. You can't have everything. They're like spoiled brats. Get over it. It was an election, democratically voted in. It's done. Let them go forward and do something for this country. Now, the protests, if they can't come and have peaceful demonstrations, if you will, then shut it down completely, all right? There's one race, the human race. And if you misbehave, I don't care on whose side you are, you should pay, whether jail time, prison time, or take away your right to vote. Who has the time to go to these demonstrations? I work. I'd love to be in Phoenix. I can't. Okay?
Well, I think a lot of them are rent-a-mob, but we'll see. You know, I mean, some of these are situations like the Jews and Allies Against Hate. That seems to be something that's kind of orchestrated there, and a few others. But the ones that travel around, the Antifa, I got a feeling that somebody's funding them. I'm thinking George Soros, but I can't prove that. But I do believe that you've got a good point there.
Yeah, but, you know, the other thing, too, is people have to realize that we have to learn to get along because the country is in dire straits. First and foremost, if you don't work, you shall not eat. It states that in the Bible, and it says you shall honor your master. And the president, you're supposed to give him respect, you know, and President Trump should not have all this opposition. And all the members he chose for his cabinet, how dare they abandon ship? They stand strong and they stand fast. If I were to get my head whacked off by one of the ISIS, if they asked me if I was a Christian, I better make darn sure I say I'm a Christian, otherwise I'll go to hell. You know?
Well, I got to go, but nothing else. I appreciate your comments there, and we have to finish this hour. And if you would like to join us tomorrow, we'll have our Millennial Roundtable and do our best to try to once again revisit some of those issues. A couple of articles I've posted, though. No Enemies on the Left. Should Trump's evangelical advisors abandon him? A piece by Michael Brown saying, no, this is one of the things they're supposed to do, speak into his life, and not all of them agree with him, but if nothing else, they are certainly ones that have an opportunity to have an influence. And so we'll see how that plays itself out in the next couple of weeks. And I am going to come back after the break with Mark Clark. His book is entitled The Problem of God. Individual that grew up in an atheist home. I don't think he went to church till the age of 19, and now has become not only a Christian, but a pastor in Vancouver, British Columbia, ministering to and reaching out to the skeptics. So we'll talk about him, his book, his ministry, all that coming up right after this.
From Affirm Films and Provident Films, who brought you War Room, comes All Saints. New pastor Michael Spurlock, his struggling congregation, and a group of refugees come together, trusting God as they plant seeds for a future that might just save them all.
Start a farm, we work together, we save the church.
All Saints, starring John Corbett. In theaters August 25th, rated PG. Parental guidance suggested. More information is available at allsaintsmovie.com.
Point of View Radio wants to fuel change in our culture, but we need your help to do it. And I use the word need very intentionally. I worked with a well-known radio ministry for 29 years, a program that helped a lot of people. They got saved, they got elected to Congress. It produced a lot of good. But people started thinking that someone else would give, and that program isn't here anymore. Your gift today can make sure that doesn't happen to Point of View. Visit pointofview.net and click the banner Change Happens With You, or call 1-800-347-5151. Pointofview.net and 800-347-5151.
Point of View will continue after this.
I just thank God for y'all. I listen to you every day, truly. I wanted to thank y'all for everything you do each day to inform Christian families and our community about the things we can do, and just the way you're so informative. I listen to you daily and love you guys and appreciate you so much.
God bless you, Kerby, for keeping this show so on track and for the decades of wonderful help to this nation that Point of View has been. We're all big fans of your work, and we pray that God will just prosper it.
As a Christian, over the years that I've followed this program, I am constantly challenged to be on guard and to evaluate what's going on. And if for no other reason, to protect the caliber and the truth of your programming, I need to participate and to back your program financially to ensure that the truth stays out there for people to hear, to view, and to be a part of.
This is Point of View Radio.
Hi, this is Kerby Anderson. You know, each day we take on the tough issues and provide a biblical perspective to them. The topics we cover are wide-ranging: apologetics, theology, prophecy, creation and evolution, intelligent design, marriage, family, child-rearing, the millennial generation, trends in society, politics, economics, business, religious liberty, the Constitution, public policy, foreign policy, military policy, tensions in the Middle East, abortion, homosexuality, pornography, sexual ethics, media, technology, history, and America's godly heritage. We talk about anything that affects your faith, your family, or your freedom. So don't go anywhere, because Point of View continues right now.
Across America, live. This is Point of View. And now, Kerby Anderson.
If you've listened to Point of View for any length of time, you know that one of the things we want to do is help you to articulate a biblical worldview, but also know how to defend a biblical worldview, and that is what we oftentimes refer to as apologetics. You run into people all the time that have misconceptions about Christianity, or a need for you to be able to give an answer for the hope that is in you and to really be able to provide a defense. So this hour we're going to spend some time once again revisiting that very important topic. It is a book that I've been looking forward to. I've seen some of the information about it on Facebook and other places as well. It is entitled The Problem of God: Answering a Skeptic's Challenges to Christianity. It is written by a former skeptic, grew up in an atheistic household, who not only became a Christian, but a pastor as well. As a matter of fact, he is the founding pastor of the Village Church in Vancouver, Canada, one of my favorite cities. Starting in 2010, they really kind of began in a school gym. Now it's a multi-site church, one of the fastest growing churches in North America. Individual that has really been using biblical teaching as well as real-world applications and apologetics to speak both to Christians and to skeptics. And so this new book, published by Zondervan, is out. It is available for you. We certainly would encourage you to look for it in your local bookstore, but we, of course, also have links to it on our website, pointofview.net. Mark, thank you for joining us today here on Point of View.
Well, thank you so much for having me. Good to be with you, Kerby.
And I've kind of watched some of the announcements, the trailers and things like this for your book, so it's just a delight to have you here. Tell your story, because you grew up in an atheistic household. I love the story. Your father said, well, your brother, I should say, but his son, we want to call him Matthew, but only one T because we don't look like Matthew in the Bible. Then he calls you Mark, so go figure. But nevertheless, talk about growing up in an atheistic household and what that was like.
Yeah, well, it's exactly that. He wouldn't have even recognized the irony because he, never had a Bible, never read it, never cared about church or anything. And so pretty adamantly against Christianity and any kind of faith or God concept. So that was the world I grew up in. No church, no Bible, no Jesus, no anything. And so I got introduced to Jesus in high school and first started attending church when I was 19. So my father passed away when I was 15. And I remember just going through kind of all those big questions, that you ask about the existence of the universe and then afterlife and morality and where did we come from, where are we going, origins, meaning, morality, destiny. And kind of coming to the conclusion after a guy introduced me to Christ that I had to really wrestle with Christianity. Is it historically accurate? Is the Bible legitimate? Does it scientifically make sense? Does it philosophically, psychologically make sense? So I wrestled through all of those questions, and that's really what the book centers around, is how do we wrestle through, how does a skeptic go through all of those massive questions and see that Christianity is the best idea in the marketplace of ideas? And so I came to see that myself, started attending church, and then when I was about 20, felt called into ministry.
Yes.
So I started studying theology and becoming a pastor, and then I moved out to Vancouver to do some more studies and felt God calling me to stay here and plant a church. And so we planted Village Church in 2010. And it's been just kind of holding on for dear life ever since.
It's just amazing. And I might just mention, I think our listeners that hear this program in California and Oregon and places like that are well aware that from my hometown of Berkeley, California, all the way up to Vancouver, so the whole Northern California, Pacific Northwest is a very secular area. Not to dismiss what's also happened in the New England area, because probably fewer people attend to church in Vermont by percentage than anywhere else, but number second is Oregon. And by the time you get to British Columbia, I've studied there at Regent College and other places, I'm well aware of what you are in. And so this need for kind of a skeptic church really meets an incredible need for that community, doesn't it?
Yeah, I think they say that Canada's probably 1 or 2 generations ahead of America in regard to secularization. So when I get the great opportunity to come down and speak in the States, I always kind of tell the crowd, I come to you from the future, and I'm here to tell you, kind of what's coming. And so, yeah, that's the world. And again, I wanted to try to start a church that was going to reach people like me. And so skeptical, unchurched, de-churched people who might have attended when they were young, and then they don't, they stop believing all this and they move on with their life. How do you preach the Bible week in and week out, constantly asking the questions that the culture around me in Vancouver is asking? So the agnostic, the atheist, the Buddhist, the Muslim, when I come to passages every week, I'm constantly having that conversation with them. And over time, those people started to show up and get their life changed and get baptized and come to Jesus and bring their friends. And so that's where the kind of, the growth started to happen. People started coming to know Jesus, and then it was just a matter of keeping up. So it started with 16 people in my house, and now, it's about 5,000 people stretched across. Actually, we're about to plant a church in Calgary, which is another city that needs Jesus as well. So, but really, just constantly coming back to these questions. And, there was kind of this movement maybe 10 years ago that kind of latched onto the postmodern idea that people aren't going to really care about, the defense of Christianity anymore. They're not going to care about truth claims. They're not going to care about, defending scientific claims or historical claims, archaeological claims with the Bible. We just move on and not do that anymore. And what I've found is that that's not true. The more I dig into these questions and do my best to answer them for people week in and week out, the more people show up and say, that was exactly my question.
Yes.
That was exactly my issue. This was exactly why I didn't like Christianity. And so it's still really a part of the culture, no matter what, certain people tell us.
Well, and again, one of the people you quote here, of course, is the Barna Research Group and Dave Kinnaman and some of them. And if I looked at the research there, these are the kinds of questions people are asking. We're going to take a break, and let me just mention real quickly, when we come back from the break, we'll get into this. There are 10 chapters: the problem of science, God's existence, the Bible, the Christ myth, something we've only talked about once here on the program, evil and suffering, hell, sex, hypocrisy, exclusivity, those kinds of issues. The book is entitled The Problem of God. It is answering a skeptic's challenges to Christianity. Now, if you'd like to get a copy, we have a link to theproblemofgod.com, and so there is a place where you can find some of that information. We also have a video there. My assignment to you is for you to watch the video. It takes a little more than 2 minutes, and then at the end, there's a share button there, and I would encourage you to then put it on maybe your Facebook page. Maybe send it to someone. Maybe a skeptic that would say, yeah, that's exactly what I'm thinking about. Okay, I want to see what this guy has to say about these kinds of things. So take the time not only to get a copy of the book, but to use the little trailer that is available. It's 2 minutes and 22 seconds long. It's available for you, and we really encourage you to not only enjoy the conversation this hour, but also to pass it on to someone else. And at the end, if you know somebody that would maybe benefit from this conversation, you can go to our website, pointofview.net. There's a listen button, so you could download a podcast and send it to them. There's a watch button. Of course, you can go to the YouTube channel and watch that as well and send it to someone. So I hope that you'll take the time to think of skeptics in the community. Perhaps you're a skeptic listening right now. I hope you'll sit back and listen to the attempts to begin to address some of these very important questions. They're relevant questions. We'll try to give you biblical answers, and we'll talk about that with Mark Clark right after this.
This is Viewpoints with Kerby Anderson.
It was a grand experiment, declare a war on poverty and years later celebrate a victory. Unfortunately, poverty won the war. The percentage of people in poverty today is just slightly lower than the percentage in the 1960s when the war to end poverty began. Now, people living in poverty now are doing better than decades ago, but we certainly have not eliminated poverty. Peter Cove has a bold vision. The title of his book is Poor No More, Rethinking Dependency and the War on Poverty. He contends that the only thing that really helps end poverty is work itself. That was the foundation of the 1996 Welfare Reform Bill, but hasn't been the focus for some time since. He understands the problem from the inside. He is founder of America Works, which is the first for-profit welfare-to-work company. He has created more than 1 million jobs for welfare recipients through various endeavors. He concluded that many of the government programs were not helping individuals because they stressed education and training over work itself. In the end, they had very little real-world work experience and were still dependent on government largesse. America Works instead offers employment services to state and local welfare agencies with the aim of placing welfare recipients in jobs quickly. Trainers work with clients on the basics, maintaining a business-like personal appearance, speaking properly, preparing a resume, and showing up on time. Clients quickly learn that success depends on their own self-discipline and on their own motivation and effort. Given the poor success rate of existing welfare programs, you would think that bureaucrats and politicians would be open to new ideas and concrete suggestions from people who have worked in the field. You would be wrong. Many liberal groups seem like they merely want to double down on the failed programs. That's why Peter Cove's book and ideas deserve a hearing. I'm Kerby Anderson, and that's my point of view.
From Sony Pictures, All Saints, the inspiring story of Pastor Michael Spurlock with John Corbett. In theaters August 25th, rated PG, allsaintsmovie.com.
You're listening to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Privileged to have with us today Mark Clark. The book is entitled The Problem of God. 10 different chapters. We'll cover just a few of those, and I highly recommend it. Published by Zondervan. It is a book that you can read and then use to talk with your skeptical friends. It's also a book I think you could hand to your skeptical friends, and so that's why we're focusing on it today on Point of View. The first one, Mark, is the issue of science. I've got a number of degrees in science, and you start out exactly the way I feel. There are days when I remember seeing various things. I remember one time on Nightline, they had Carl Sagan, and then they had a pastor, and I thought, what a mismatch. You got a man with Cornell University credentials and then a pastor. And so often we hear this idea that there's a conflict between Christianity and science, between faith and science. Of course, I've co-authored a book on which we talked about the fact that we wouldn't even have the scientific method if it weren't for the Christian involvement. But this was one of the problems for you. Hasn't science disproved Christianity? Hasn't science disproved God? How should we think about that?
Well, I think what we recognize is the deeper that science delves into things, no matter the discipline, whether it's biology or astronomy or whatever discipline we're talking about, it's actually creating more evidence for the existence of God. As science goes deeper, what I talk about in the book is generations ago, they thought that by the end of the 20th century, that we would, no one would believe in God anymore because science would have done its work. We would have got ahead of it. We would have figured out all the rational reasons why nature works and so on and so forth. And the idea of mythological figures like gods that transcend nature they'll be looked at as silly, and so we'll have moved on. And what we realize now is, as Leslie Newbigin pointed out, there's actually more atheists in the humanities than there are in the sciences, because science actually keeps pointing. The deeper we look into cosmology, the deeper we look into biology. I talk about in the book the DNA code and how these strands of information, 30 encyclopedias of information in strands of DNA. The deeper, Darwin had observational science, where he was looking on the outsides of things, being able to go inside, but there wasn't DNA back then. Now we're seeing all this information. And so the further we actually go, the more evidence there is for the existence of God. And so that's what science is finding over and over and over again. And so, just constantly trying to draw people back to the reality versus the mythology. I grew up in a situation where it was the narrative that was told to me, whether it was around the dinner table or while I was watching media or listening in school, was that, look, science is the opposite to any kind of faith or ideas. And that's just a presupposition and assumption that needs to be challenged.
Certainly. Well, and again, your second chapter talks about that more in terms of the problem of God's existence, because whether you look in the microscope at the small dimensions, you just mentioned that a minute ago, in terms of our DNA, it was Darwin's black box, as Michael Behe says, because, if you look through a light microscope, all you see is this bag of goo. It looks like, that's why we call it protoplasm. But now the electron microscope opens it up. We recognize the level of design in the DNA. But if we look, as we did yesterday in our telescopes at the eclipse, those of us, at least in the continental part of the United States, got to see this eclipse, and some of our listeners were right in the path of totality. You also see that this is interesting, a kind of an odd coincidence, that you have a total solar eclipse because the distance from the Earth to the moon compared to the Earth to the sun is 400 times larger, but the Earth or the sun is 400 times larger than the moon, and so you get this total solar eclipse. So wherever you look, whether it's design in the large dimensions through a telescope or design in the small dimensions with a microscope, that's a pretty powerful argument for the existence of God, or for a designer, isn't there?
Yeah, that's right. And I think that as I kind of went along and studied this stuff more, I realized that the people I was kind of growing up with and the narrative that we'd been pitched through media and just the assumptions needed to be challenged. And I began to realize that every single person has an actual faith position, whether they realize it or not. The most secular person, the most agnostic person that I know growing up, the kids I hung out with, we never talked about God. We didn't, but every single one of them actually has a worldview that now, whether they know it or not, they've constructed it. And some of their worldviews are, hey, look, science is the opposite to faith. But then when you push back and you start to show them some of these things, they realize, wait a minute, that was just a presupposition that I hadn't really thought through very well. And so I tell a story in the book about a nurse that I know who was in the hospital, and a hospital is supposed to be a very secular place. You're not supposed to let your view, your religious or your worldview, inform anything to do with your work as a nurse. And so there was a group of doctors who had to take a guy off of life support. And when they did that, they were all standing around and they said, well, at least he's not suffering anymore. And it dawned on her that that's a metaphysical statement, that that's actually a faith position, because how do they know that? How do they know that he's not suffering more than he was before he died? So every single one of us is walking around with assumptions and faith positions and worldviews, whether we know how we constructed them or not. And so this book is all about challenging those and saying, is the worldview that you've actually adopted the most rational, the most reasonable according to the evidence?
Well, let's take one of those examples because it's in the God chapter. And that is, we can use arguments for the existence of God, the cosmological argument, cause and effect, or the design. But there's another argument. It's the moral argument. And you talk about when you were working with an atheist and you were at Michael's Arts and Crafts, you would have all sorts of conversation. But at one point there, he said, I believe all morality is culturally constructed, relative, and a product of our evolution. And that's wrong for our Western ideals to be projected onto other cultures. So then you ask, well, I'll let you ask the question, but it really was a good one, because if you went into a village in the middle of the jungle and they brought your sister along and they captured her, tied her up, and tortured her, then finish that off, because what you say and what you question you ask helped him understand he really is holding to a worldview that doesn't hold together logically. Explain.
It doesn't play out. Yeah, so I said if we went to a jungle somewhere and they, instead of loving your neighbors, they ate them, and that was their kind of moral view. And they, you couldn't say they had done something decisively wrong. All that you could say that they'd done something that disagreed with the culture that you grew up in. And he kind of paused and sat there and thought for a while, and then he said, yeah, you're right. I would have to say that. I could not say they'd done something decisively wrong. I could only say the country I grew up in disagrees with cannibalizing people, but it's okay to do it because, this is what your culture believes. And right there was this fundamental breakdown because no one's going to actually live like that.
No.
And the guy who tries to sit and argue with me that it's okay to have complete moral relativism in a culture, I like to say to our church, when someone starts telling you that, just give them a little punch in the throat. And when they tell you that they don't like that, just say, well, I'm sorry, I'm not going to let you project your moral views on me. I like to punch people in the throat. So obviously this stuff breaks down when you try to live it out. And this is part of the point. When we're evaluating the worldview that we're going to live by, it actually has to make sense and play out in real life. That's one of the filters that you should put on whether if something is true and whether you should adopt it. Can I actually play this out in real life, or will this break down? And so what his whole reality was, maybe there is a moral law.
Yeah.
And if there's a moral law, then there has to be a moral law giver.
Very good argument. And again, this is, I think, illustrative. And I use this a lot when I used to speak on college campus. Of course, now I do this a lot more than I do on campus. But when somebody says, well, I don't believe there's any right or wrong, well, take their iPhone, and all of a sudden they believe something's wrong. No, wait a minute, you can't do that. Well, no, you just told me there's no right or wrong. It's just, I'm just doing what I need to do. Or, I should have the freedom to do whatever I want, Well, then they start, I have the freedom as long as it doesn't hurt anybody. Okay, define hurt, and how do you define that, and what's right?
Exactly.
And, you just cannot live in that world. And so what you call the test of correspondence, your worldview does not correspond with reality. There's an inconsistency there, and your book is really good at doing that. We need to take a break. I already have some calls coming in, so if you'd like to join us, 1-800-351-1212. Probably going to sprinkle just a few calls in here because I want to hear from Mark Clark, but we'll get into a little bit more of his book, The Problem of God. If you'd like to know more about him, if you'd like to know more about his book, just click on that button that says See More. That will take you to his website, but then again, if you want to know more about that, click on the button that says Author and tells you a little bit about him. And certainly if you wanted to contact him, or if you're going to be traveling into Canada, I would encourage you to visit his church and to find out a little bit more about what he's doing there as well. But let's take a break. When we come back, we will take some more phone calls. 1-800-351-1212. Some of you have some questions about how to speak to your kids. I think you're going to find this very helpful. But we are going to talk at least about the problem of the Bible and also the problem of the Christ myth. If you watch the trailer for this particular book, Pastor Mark Clark spends some time using that illustration, and we've talked about this once because this meme has kind of shown up a few times on Facebook and things like that. And then we'll get into a couple of other of the issues. We won't even try to cover all 10 chapters. That's why I encourage you to get a copy of the book. It is published by Zondervan. You can look for it in your local bookstore or find the link that we have here and to order it and to benefit from some of the insightful perspective of Mark Clark. Let's take a break. If you'd like to join us, 1-800-351-1212. We'll be right back.
Point of View turned life right side up for Emily's children. Emily listens in Illinois. She and her husband blissfully sent their children off each day to what she called our small, quaint public school until Point of View led them to watch the documentary Indoctrination. She said, "We came to realize the need for us to educate our children at home. We want their education to be built on the solid foundation of Scripture." Emily said that would not have happened were it not for Point of View's bold consistency of shining light on public education. Your support for Point of View changes the future for children like Emily's. It leads people to start schools and ministries and businesses that change lives. How has the Truth Team impacted you? Please invest to bring truth to other families like Emily's. Support Truth today. Visit pointofview.net/team or call 1-800-347-5151. 800-347-5151 and pointofview.net/team.
Point of View will continue after this.
You are listening to Point of View. The opinions expressed on Point of View do not necessarily reflect the views of the management or staff of this station. And now, here again is Kerby Anderson.
Continue our conversation today with Pastor Mark Clark. The book is entitled The Problem of God, just now making its way to the bookstores. And if you'd like to order a copy, we've made it very easy. And all of that is available on our website, pointofview.net. If you'd like to join us, 1-800-351-1212. We'll get to those calls in just a minute. But Mark, I thought we'd at least put one more issue on the table, and that is the Bible. Well, it's full of myths and errors. It's not historically accurate. It's full of contradictions. You heard those kinds of phrases before. And it seems to me that that's one of the issues, and perhaps the foundational issue, because if you can show the historical accuracy and the coherence of the Bible, then that begins to answer some of the other questions that sometimes skeptics have. True?
Yeah, and I think that, again, it's part of just the assumption and part of the narrative that gets built into our culture that doesn't get tested by people. So people out on the street just say, oh, the Bible's full of errors, full of contradictions. And it's like, okay, well, name one. And they either don't have one, or the ones that they have been, proven over and over again to not be contradictions at all. So I talk about a few of those examples in the book and show that, these aren't contradictions at all. So, for instance, I would talk to a regular Joe on the street, and they say, well, Matthew says there's, 2 angels at the tomb, and John says that there's one, ergo, they didn't, they're wrong. There's a contradiction. And, we talk about in the book the idea that, no, where there's 2, there's 1. And one of the gospel writers is just honing in on the one that talked, and the other one's telling us how many angels were actually there. That's not a contradiction. The contradiction would be if one of them said there were 5 angels, and the other one said there was 1. Then there'd be a contradiction, but one of them's just focusing in on what the angel said versus telling us how many were there. And so you go through the line of all of these issues, and you realize that over and over again, legit historians, secular historians, have come and they said that the Bible is the most trusted document in antiquity, that if we can't trust it, we can't trust most of what we've seen historically speaking, because the length of time that actually passed between the events themselves and the writing down of the events is very short in regard to other documents of antiquity that we trust fully. And we say these documents record history, and they're written 1,000 years after the fact, where the Gospels were written, maybe 40 years after the life of Jesus, and the letters of Paul are written, some of them are written, 30 years after. And so what we're dealing with is a document that was written while the eyewitnesses were still alive. And what you want to do if you're starting a religion is you want to make sure everyone's dead so that you can make up stories. You can make up stories of Jesus walking on water, feeding 5,000 people, drowning 2,000 pigs by throwing demons into them. Because if people are still around, they're going to say that never happened. I lived in that small town.
Yes.
There was never those pigs. That didn't really, and so that document will never gain traction. And so what religions usually do if they want to make up lies is they have to wait till all the eyewitnesses are dead. But the New Testament gets birthed into this reality where it says, go and ask them. This person, the Gospel of Mark I talk about in the book, Alexander and Rufus, he starts naming people like they're still around. Go ask them if this really happened. Paul says he saw, 500 people saw him resurrected, and some of whom are still alive, meaning go and ask them. And so this is very unique, and historians really look at the New Testament and the Old and say, this is very interesting, that it's very unique and very accurate, and I think we've got to trust it.
Very good. Let's take some phone calls along the way. 1-800-351-1212. We'll head to Michigan first. Keith, thank you for joining us today here on Point of View. Keith, are you there? Well, we'll put Keith on hold, and we'll get to that in just a minute. Let's, if we can, talk about the Christ myth. That was another one, and of course, you talk about that in the trailer. We've mentioned that once here, but I'd love to get into it because you have people saying, well, the Bible was borrowed from Christ. In other words, you have similarities with the story of Dionysus and Mithras and Horus and Isis and Hermes and others. And so you have them with 12 disciples. They were born on December 25th. They may have even had somebody baptize them in a river. They appeared to the disciples later, on and on and on. They were buried in a tomb. They rose from the tomb. First of all, it turns out that those aren't what we think they are, but I think it's an important point to make because I see this meme where it tries to compare Jesus to these other ancient myths, and this is, again, something that you've taken on in an entire chapter in your book.
Yeah, and I think it's probably a unique chapter in the book in regard to other apologetics books that I've read that don't necessarily deal with this issue, and I think it's a really important one because when I talk to people on the streets of Vancouver, this is a real important point even on college campuses. And my neighbor brought this up to me and said, I don't believe in any of this because Christianity was made up after religions had already existed thousands of years before Christianity ever came into existence. And I said, well, what do you mean? And he starts citing all these things out of Zeitgeist, which is this internet movie, right, and Religulous, the Bill Maher movie, and he starts talking about well, Horus was born on December 25th, born of a virgin. 3 kings, followed a star to his birth. He was crucified, resurrected 3 days later, had 12 disciples, all these parallels. And so I started going, what? So once you start reading the actual myths themselves, so there's 2 things that kind of go wrong with this. The first is the actual myths themselves aren't parallels to Christianity.
They're not even close, yeah.
Not even close. And secondly, Christianity doesn't parallel with them. So what I mean is, even if Horus was born on December 25th, Jesus wasn't born on December 25th. We all know that. He was probably born September, October. We celebrate him because of the Saturnalia, the Roman god, and they were trying to posit Christianity against that celebration. And so December 25th is not a parallel. Nobody believes Jesus was born on December 25th. And no one, thinks that 3 kings, sorry to ruin everyone's Christmas, actually visited the birth of Jesus. That's not a biblical concept. There were magi who weren't kings. They were Babylonian, wizards almost. and they came to visit Jesus, and they were carrying gold, frankincense, and myrrh. But it doesn't mean that there were 3 of them. It just says they were carrying those things. There could have been 40 of them. We actually have no idea how many of them there were. And so these so-called parallels with Christianity aren't really there, and they weren't even at the birth of Jesus. It's the shepherds that were at the birth. The Magi showed up probably when he was 2 or 3 years old, as the Gospel of Matthew tells us. So once you start delving into what actually Christianity teaches and what these actual mythologies teach, the parallels fall away very quickly, because what they'll say is a parallel of one of the gods. He was crucified on a tree, and 3 days later resurrected is really just, some kind of death by spear, and then he gets thrown into a lake and he gets eaten by crocodiles, and then one piece of his heart falls out onto the road or something, and then they say, well, that's resurrection, and he died by spear, so that's crucifixion. And it's kind of like, well, that's a bit of a stretch.
For sure. And what parallels you do see, some people have even suggested came after the fact, in other words, attempts by the pagans to try to match Christianity rather than the other way.
That's right.
So again, just an outstanding chapter, because it's something I have dealt with once on the program here and once in my Sunday school class, but that's worth the price of the book alone, chapter 4. But let's go back to the phones. I tried to get to Keith just a minute ago, and I think we've got connection with him in Michigan. So Keith, what would you like to ask?
Oh, I'd like to make a comment and then a question. The comment, it's reminding me of books that I read many, many years ago. It was Josh McDowell. He answers tough questions. Skeptics ask reasons skeptics should consider Christianity. And so you're right on the mark. Sorry for the bad pun. But But there's also another gentleman that I listened to, his J. Warner Wallace. He was a
he's been on a few times with us. Yes, go ahead.
Yeah, and it's the same thing. The different people who are in there saying different points of view, and he said that actually supports better viewpoint of Christianity than disallowing it, and I thought that was great. One of the things I grew up in Oregon, even though I'm in Michigan and I'm born in Michigan. I grew up in Oregon. In Roseburg, Eugene, and so I understand about the skeptics and the atheist point of view, because that's how I was raised. I was like, there's no such thing as God or anything like that. But my stepfather that I was being raised by, he was a physicist, so it was always take a scientific viewpoint of the world and let's examine it and let's look at the evidence. But then when I started reading how creation was and how miraculous a cell is and in the human body and everything that goes along with it, and it's like this has to be intelligent design. I mean, there's so much evidence, physical evidence, so much scientific evidence of an instant creationism. I was like, I have no choice but to accept that there is an intelligent design, there is a God. And so where does that fit in my life? I can't ignore this. So I came to my faith in this way, and very scientific in point of view. And so now I have 2 teenage boys that I'm looking at, and I'm trying to raise. And we homeschool, And I realized that in a very few short years, it's very fast, these teenage boys are going to go out into the world.
Sure. Let me put you on hold. And I think the question, of course, is how do we prepare them? And that's something we've talked about here on Point of View as well. We'll get some comments from Mark Clark right after these important messages.
Welcome to the First Liberty Briefing. I'm Jeremy Dice. In 1963, the Supreme Court of the United States ended the public reading of the Bible in public schools. For years, students in the school district of Abington Township listened to a student read a passage from the Bible, recite the Lord's Prayer, provide announcements, and end with everyone reciting the pledge of the American flag together. That was too much involvement by the school for the court. The court determined that neutrality had been breached and a violation of the Establishment Clause had occurred. But the question remains, can you teach the Bible in the public schools? The answer is yes. At the end of the court's opinion in Abington v. Schempp, the court noted, quote, "It might well be said that one's education is not complete without a study of comparative religion or the history of religion and its relationship to the advancement of civilization. It certainly may be said that the Bible is worthy of study for its literary and historic qualities. Nothing we have said here indicates that such study of the Bible or of religion, when presented objectively as part of a secular program of education, may not be affected consistently with the First Amendment." So the Bible can be taught in the schools. Exactly how is a more difficult conversation. To learn how First Liberty is protecting religious liberty for all Americans, visit firstliberty.org.
You can learn how to protect religious freedom in the workplace, public schools, your church, the military, and more by downloading First Liberty's free Religious Liberty Protection Kits at firstliberty.org. That's firstliberty.org. If you want hope for religious freedom, go to firstliberty.org.
Now, back to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Continuing our conversation today with Mark Clark, the author of the book, The Problem of God. And Mark, you know, whether you look at Keith and his sons or your daughters, I mean, eventually they're going to have to own the faith themselves. And we have found over the years by having various guests with Summit Ministries, various apologists. We mentioned J. Warner Wallace. He even has material for kids. Or even my own ministry, Pro Ministries, we do a mind games. And one of my colleagues will go into the first session and pretend to be a secular professor, a non-Christian professor, and ask the students just a series of questions. And I'll guarantee within minutes, they're all looking at their shoes. They won't even make eye contact because they just don't have the ability, the intellectual and spiritual ability to give a good and cogent answer. So it's not just enough to teach our kids what they believe. They need to know why they believe. And I know that's one of the things that you feel is so important about your book, The Problem of God.
Yeah, I really wanted, I mean, there's other apologetics books out there that address, you know, some similar questions as my book addresses, but I really wanted it to be a good balance of good thinking, but also street level, rationale, blue collar apologetics almost, or defense of the faith. And so I wanted kids to be able to engage it. And so really what we want to try to do is equip our kids like you said, to be able to say, here's the defense of why I believe what I believe. And I think sometimes we've lost a bit of that in the church because, we have this great history of thinkers, of philosophy, of theology. Christianity has for a long time been something of the mind. Even the university itself is a Christian invention. The idea of deep study and thinking and discipleship of the mind has always been a very high priority for Christianity. And then it seems over the last generation, Christianity's kind of almost swung over to being an emotional affair, where it's all about emotional experiences. And so kids grow up in youth groups, and it's licorice up the nose and stuff on the face, and youth retreats where you're just having, and they get out of it and they're like, okay, I don't even know why I believe. I don't know what I believe. I don't know how to articulate or defend it. And they walk away from the faith, as we see so many do. And so how do we make their youth experience much more meaningful in order to equip them in actually how to think? That's a huge goal that the church needs to come back to. And that's why even in my preaching every week, I'm constantly doing apologetics every week almost, because I want my church at every age level, there's high school kids all the way up to 85-year-olds and 90-year-olds. I'm not just going to preach some stuff. I want to show you how I got there, and I want to address the real questions that real people in high school are actually dealing with, which is why there's a chapter on sex in the book, which makes it probably unique in the world of apologetics books, because sex is a massive reason why kids in college and high school don't want to become Christians. It's like, if I have to commit that I'm only going to have sex with the person I'm going to marry and I have to wait till marriage, there's a reason I don't want to become a Christian at all. So I address for a full chapter all the mythology around God being anti-sex and show that he's not.
Well, and again, I think that's one of the issues we're going to have to teach our kids to know how to answer those questions. And I think we ask a lot of those questions around the dinner table. But just before we run out of time, I wanted to jump to the chapter on the problem of exclusivity. One of the things we do, Mark, is on Wednesday we have a millennial roundtable, and we bring millennials in here. And I guarantee you Christian millennials have as much problem with that as the non-Christians, and that is this exclusivity of Christ. You even have the heresy of Ricky Bobby at one point. Again, gotta love a guy that's quoting from Talladega Nights to illustrate the point. But nevertheless, that's an issue too, because that's one of the big issues. It's evil and suffering, but, again, I appreciate you included a chapter on exclusivity, because that's a deal breaker for the younger generation. How is it that there's only one way to God? Well, first of all, John 14:6 kind of gives us that answer, but how do you respond to that when you have young people asking that question?
Yeah. Well, one of the things is just to recognize that the beautiful thing about Christianity and why it stands out is, on the surface it feels offensive, but we know logically that if something, if I'm either wearing socks or I'm not. And so to say Christianity is true and another religion that defies everything that Christianity teaches is true at the same time, let's just admit that the only reason we're saying that is so we can all get along and sit around the Thanksgiving table and not fight with each other. We're not saying it because it actually makes sense. Either Christianity is true or Islam is true, or Judaism is true, or Mormonism. You can't have them both be true at the same time. Let's just agree with that, because right after you get below the surface of the basic concepts of the golden rule or something, you're into contradictions on hell, the Bible, the God, humankind. Every piece of the belief system actually contradicts itself or contradicts each other. And so they both can't be right at the same time. So what's driven us to that is what's called, metaphysical pluralism, where we can have cultural pluralism, where we all live in this kind of pluralistic society and we exist together and love one another and fight for one another's beliefs to believe things. That's great. But we don't want to then do metaphysical pluralism, which is to say we believe everyone's view on God is true. That's a fundamental, mistake in logic. And so what I talk about in my church is it might seem like Christianity is offensive by saying Jesus is the only way, but this is where Christianity is beautiful, because what it says is every other worldview, every other religion, every other concept has us trying to get up the mountain to God by what we do. How can I earn it? What kind of pilgrimages do I need to go on? What rules do I need to follow to get up the mountain? And Christianity is the only one that says God actually came down the mountain for you. And so it's not offensively, exclusivistic. It's positively exclusivistic. It's saying Jesus came down for you, died on the cross for you, rose again for you, and he's offering you eternal life. And this is the only way to connect to God. And if this is true, then all the rest of it isn't. And to deal with that, scandal in our own heart and not just deny it so we can get along with people, but really dig into the scandal, really dig in and doubt our doubts and see if, it's actually more logical. And I think it is.
Well, again, we've only covered just a few, maybe about half of the chapters in the book, but these, I think, are a great illustration of the excellent material that's in the book, The Problem of God, Answering a Skeptic's Challenges to Christianity. And Matt, I might just mention we have a link to theproblemofgod.com. And there's a place where, of course, people could pre-order. Now it's out, so they could actually order the book. Of course, they can find it in the local bookstore. They can order it online. But also there is a trailer, a video trailer. And my assignment to everybody, if you've been listening to the program, is to watch the trailer. It's about 2 minutes long. You'll get a chance to see Mark demonstrate some of this. Then hit the share button and put it on your Facebook page or send it to somebody. Put it as a Twitter feed or in one way or another, start the conversation, and I think you will appreciate that as well. So, Mark, I appreciate you writing the book. It has been a delight to get to know you, and I hope this will be the first of many opportunities to talk with you here on Point of View.
Thank you so much for having me, Kerby. Really appreciate it.
Again, book is entitled The Problem of God. We have a link to theproblemofgod.com. Would really encourage you to get some of that information about the book. And if you want to pass that on to others, this is a book that I would encourage you to read. This is a book that I think is written in a way that young people can read it as well. This is a book you might hand to your skeptical friends and say, okay, maybe dip into a chapter. You might read one chapter and say, okay, I've read this chapter. What do you think about it? Or you might get two copies, your copy and their copy, and say, I'll tell you what, you read a chapter, I read a chapter. We'll talk about it. You'll find that it will really start a conversation. So again, I appreciate the work that Mark has done in the book. I knew it was about ready to come out in August 22nd, and that's the date today. So that's why we wanted to cover it as soon as it hit the shelves of your bookstore. That's all we have for today. I want to encourage you to visit our website, pointofview.net. It has been a very lean summer, so if you can help us out financially by clicking on that button that says donate, we would greatly appreciate that. I want to thank Andrew and Steve and Elisa for their help behind the scenes. We'll see you back here tomorrow for our Millennial Roundtable. We'll see you then.
From Affirm Films and Provident Films, who brought you War Room, comes All Saints. New pastor Michael Spurlock, his struggling congregation, and a group of refugees come together, trusting God as they plant seeds for a future that might just save them all.
Start a farm, we work together, we save the church.
All Saints, starring John Corbett. In theaters August 25th, rated PG. Parental guidance suggested. More information is available at allsaintsmovie.com.
Point of View Radio wants to fuel change in our culture, but we need your help to do it. And I use the word need very intentionally. I worked with a well-known radio ministry for 29 years, a program that helped a lot of people. They got saved, they got elected to Congress. It produced a lot of good. But people started thinking that someone else would give, and that program isn't here anymore. Your gift today can make sure that doesn't happen to Point of View. Visit pointofview.net and click the banner Change Happens With You, or call 1-800-347-5151. Pointofview.net at 800-347-5151. Point of View is produced by Point of View Ministries.